Hey there, it's Ryan, and today we are going to be painting a nice, finely detailed, real-time landscape with acrylic paints. And before we begin, I will run you through our materials. I will be personally working with pigments from Winsor & Newton with my brush set. It is a 5-piece brush set, and I use it for all the lessons here on the channel. With that, I will be working on an 8x10 inch canvas. I have a small dish of water and some paper towel to wipe off all of my excess water and pigment. Now, if you're looking at the image and you're thinking, oh no, I'm not great at drawing, don't worry, I also have the traceable up over on Patreon, so you will get the perspective, the sizing, the details, all of that just right. And up there you can also get things like the reference photos, bonus lessons, we do art critiques, and you can also get my ebooks, which include acrylics for beginners. So if you're interested, check it out, but those are the materials and we are about to get started. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we will dip the bottom third of it into a little bit of water. This will just help us blend on the canvas a bit easier. From there, we'll grab an abundance of our titanium white, about a third of that in cerulean blue, a hint of Mars black, and we'll mix up a fairly neutral grayish blue. We don't want anything too saturated. We don't want anything too dark. But at the same time, we want it to be a great hue that can adopt additional light in areas where we're going to have clouds. So I'm going to take this and we'll just start by creating a very simple block-in using the larger flat-headed brush because it can adopt a lot of paint. There's nice sharp edges to craft around the edges of our mountains and our more definitive clouds. Though we are going to be painting a lot of non-definitive clouds atop this block-in layer right here. And that's how we're going to make it much more interesting, but we get to start with something quite basic, which is nice because it gives us a chance to warm up with our brush and get acquainted with the medium again. And while I initially started applying the paint in all of these different directions, once I have a good amount on the canvas and we've covered the majority of our surface area, I do like to go back over it with horizontal strokes. That way, if brush strokes are seen through our application, at the very least they're cohesive, right? Though we can avoid them, for the most part, by working our brush fairly softly over these areas. Typically, when you apply more pressure with your brush, you push paint to the top and the bottom, and that's what renders the streaky aesthetic. And we can work around that by just being softer with our brush. So I'll get this top corner, and then we'll start applying our clouds. From there, for our first set of clouds, we're going to go something akin to a neutral gray with hints of our blue hue. I'm mixing it right beside our initial mixture. That way I can see what it'll look like on the canvas next to that pigment and even mixed with it to a point. I think this is a really pretty mix. We'll just make it slightly darker. And we'll start applying this in a couple of spots. Now, I do think I like here a lot, towards the bottom of our cloud. It's blending in with the blue, which is great, because the more I work it out, and we will do so to a good extent, the more it just fades into the distance. And we want that because you want this to be a more definitive, sharp cloud, where we want this to be much more subtle. Building layers and depth through clouds in this way. painting over a bit of my mountain, that's okay. We can always go back and redraw it. And we'll also have some over here. You can see that it looked a little bit dark on our palette, but once we get it on the canvas, it blends with that brighter blue. I think it ends up pretty perfect. Trying not to scrape too much into the canvas, but I do it a little bit here and there. And we'll also interject a bit at the top. At this point the blue is essentially fully dry, so I'm using a very watery mix. That way we can blend a wet pigment over a dry pigment, still get those nice soft transitions, just like so. Now we'll create a brighter variant of that same mix, maybe interject a hint more of our blue, but for the most part this is a titanium white heavy redo on the pigment. And then we're going to interject some light towards the top of these clouds. Still want it to be nice and subtle. And again, at this point the majority of the pigment has dried on the canvas, so our way of blending is just to make our brush fairly damp. We create these optical blends instead of true ones. By working over it softly, we take out those harsh lines in the edge, just have it fade off into the sky. But we can also make more definitive lines for our clouds. You can see these in the reference photo and I like them a lot. There we go. You don't want to overwork this, you don't want to do too much, because it really is just a subtle background. But I think that's pretty good. Okay, now we'll take a step back, and right under this definitive cloud, right under this portion of our definitive cloud, we have openings. And I want to interject the softer cloud that we have at top right into there. So we're going to start with, yet again, an abundance of titanium white, hint of Mars black, cerulean blue, and we want something that's kind of a mix between both of these right now. We want that blue to be showing through the cloud to articulate the fact that it is still a portion of a almost open sky, but we do want some cloud covering it, just a very non-opaque cloud. So we'll put these two together, and I think this is actually a really nice mixture. From there, we'll head underneath, again using that sharper edge of the brush to cut along and around. Work our way down. By the way, for almost all of this, I do recommend doing a couple of layers. Just make sure it's nice and thick. Often acrylics do look significantly more professional when we do take the time to interject those extra layers and care. So we'll just fill this in like so. You can tell the color's a little bit off, that's okay. Now let's play with it. Extra Mars black and titanium white to take out saturation, make it a bit more of the darker cloud hue value. Going to apply this under this cloud, and that darker area is going to make the light from the cloud pop better. And then we'll let it dissipate as we work downwards. I think we'll also throw a bit of it in there, have it blend down, maybe over the entirety even. Again, I don't want too much detail, and simplifying can be very valuable. From there, let's now mix just a little bit more of the much brighter cerulean blue mix that we used for the openings in the sky. That was just a hint of Mars black, good amount of titanium white and cerulean blue. And now we'll be a little bit choosy. Where we have the true openings, we'll blend those out. Everything should still be wet, so it's an easy blend, but even if it's not, again, we just use more water. And this will tie the top in with the bottom quite well. I think it all does need another layer, but this is what we were aiming for. Okay, now that the top here has a chance to fully dry, I'm going to switch over to my filbert brush. As you can see, it has nice round edges, great for getting a softer aesthetic in detailed areas. We're going to mix up a hue, a value, that's incredibly close to that which we had for the clouds, but we're just going to make it a little bit brighter. So you can see I'm mixing right next to that original area on my palette. I am just adding slightly more titanium white. We do need maybe a little bit more Mars black because I want it to be closer to a gray than a blue at this point. As we get more and more into the light, we move farther and farther away from the blue. We're going to take the majority of the pigment off our brush. We're going to make sure our brush is damp. And then we're going to find the areas that are going to receive the most highlight. So this cloud right here, it has a bit of a shelf. It extends outwards, and therefore we get that highlight on the edge. I'm doing slight blend down. It's not a lot of work, but does a lot for the painting. Here again, blending the bottom portion just a little bit. You don't want to blend it far down, otherwise you make it look like that face of the cloud that's facing us is very wide. There we are. You can do a little bit of a blend at the top, but I don't like to do much. I like the top application to be slightly sharper. So we're not doing much, but we're making a big difference where we are. Then here we'll make it a little bit spotty. Create openings in between our clouds just to create some diversity. Have it look like it's really just fading up into the open blue sky. Just like that. Now, from here, we'll start working on the clouds that are a bit closer to us. They'll have more detail, they'll have more depth, brighter brights, darker darks. And we're going to start with some of our darks. We need this to be, again, darker than our last pigment that we used for the shadow. So I'll mix right beside that. We still need some of our cerulean blue, though not as much, right? We're not going to have as much of that light reflecting from the sky and atmosphere, but we still will have some. So we'll mix just enough, and we don't want it to be dramatically darker than that which we've had before, just a bit. We also need a fair amount of this pigment, so you can see that I'm continuously going back, adding more, and building it out. With that, I think we have a beautiful pigment right here. And we'll start looking at my drawings. I just redrew it in with a little bit of white chalk. You can use Conte. And if you need help with that drawing, remember, the traceable is up over on Patreon, which you can download the gridded or non-gridded version. And in addition to that, if you're not up on Patreon, you can see the drawing at the start of the video. All right, so I just did a rough sketch of where I wanted it to be yet again. I'm not going all the way to the edges with this darker mix. I'm keeping quite a bit of space, actually, and intentionally so, for mixing in a brighter hue. And I'll throw this on the other side. I want to do both sides at once, just so that the pigments are cohesive. I want to make this bottom area a bit softer because I don't want a hard edge. I want the cloud to be working over the mountain, something that we'll attend to a little bit later, but we can start setting up now. Just make sure the job isn't difficult on us. So once I have this in, now we'll get to the brighter mix, and we want to really clean our brush, take all of that excess pigment off of it, because we want to go in with some brighter hues. Let's get a bit closer. So from here, brightest pigment yet. We can see these are our previous brighter pigments. Everything on my palette has dried, so I'm not worried about working atop it. But we're not going to go unbelievably brighter. We are going to go brighter. And we can build the brightness in multiple layers should we want to. I think that this is a beautiful pigment. Let's apply this fairly close to the edge of the drawing and fairly close to the darker pigment we just incorporated. You can see I'm doing this on both sides. There's less at the bottom than there is at the top because we'll get more light at the top. There we go. And now we're going to do a bit of a blend. So I'm going to work my brush in an X-shaped pattern for the most part. That's going to bring pigment not only left and right, but up and down. And I waited until I had it all the way surrounding. That way I wasn't diluting pigment as I worked around. Now we're slowly going to work our way in. I can tell my darker gray is starting to dry, so I might need to wet my brush a bit more, re-interject that control. You know what? I think we're actually okay for this side. We can also go in with that darker pigment, reintroduce it, give it that life again. There we go. Not a bad start. Still a lot to do, but let's head over to the other side while it's still somewhat wet. Alright, now I'm going to start by just cleaning off my brush because it does have a lot of that dark pigment. We'll grab our brighter pigment. Again, not on the absolute edges, but close to them. And we're yet to connect with the darker hue. Now I know I do need more water on my brush to get this mix going the way that we want to, so I'll just add that. You can see that it's pretty much dry at this point, so this is actually good. This is where we'll learn a lesson. We'll go back, we'll grab some of that darker pigment, we'll reintroduce that, and we'll start creating those blends through newly mixed pigment. At the very least, that initial dark application can act as a base layer, right? There we go. And we'll just soften those values. I have a lot more work to do on this one than we did the last. Let's go for a medium mix, something in between both of these. Not too bright, not too dark, not too blue, not too gray. Put that in between. And then you know what we really need? Brighter applications. So, titanium white in abundance, hint of Mars black, hint of cerulean blue. We want to remix what we have right there. There we go. Switch over to our filbert. Make sure it's nice and damp. We can use the sharp top of it to render sharp lines. We can use the corners, as you could see earlier, to render softer blends and applications, and that's what we're doing. So we'll do some blending down with this brush. Want a lot of light on this side. And you can see that the light along the edges staggers. Here it's a little bit less, and then we're going to get to significantly more. If we have brush strokes from this filbert, it's also not a bad thing at all, because it'll just look like volume in the cloud. And here again I have that soft blend because of my brush's edges. Now, stepping back, as you can see, the new clouds are significantly darker than the ones in the background. I do think we need to soften these a bit, but I want to continue working the edges first. And to do so, I want a lot of that bright pigment. I'm going to mix it, not apply it, with the larger flat-headed brush, just because it's ideal for mixing grand amounts of paint quickly. Switch back on over to the filbert. And I'm reinforcing those edges, building those layers. I'm not going in with a brighter pigment, but you'll notice that it looks brighter this time. And that's because we're building highlight on top of highlight, rather than highlight on top of a darker base layer. Because acrylics are thin, you are almost never actually applying the pigment that you have on your palette. You're applying that in conjunction with that which you have underneath on your canvas. And the two amalgamate, they combine. And just like that, it's already looking quite a bit better, right? You have little clouds that are in front. This is one. Kind of optically connects with this right here though, which I like. Brush is damp, by the way. All of this is fully dry at this point. I'm doing wet into dry. And I can tell in the reference photo there's another cloud right about here, or at least an extension of this one that protrudes and catches more light. So we'll just paint that in. There we go. All right, that can definitely be brightened, but I do want to let it dry before we add the extra details and bring up those values. Let's head on over to the other side. So as you can see, our edges over here are very undefined and unfinished. So we can start with that. Give it some unique offshoots. Really build on our shapes, our forms. Trying to be a bit wispy with some of these applications as well. All of the chalk and conte will just come off with a little bit of application, which is wonderful, keeps it easy. And that's just because the water on the brush will essentially wash away the chalk on the canvas. Okay. So, we've really brightened that up. I think that helped dramatically. There's another cloud in front here. And it's a fairly unique shape. It's interesting. Like so. And then it kind of blends back into the background. I have too much pigment on my brush to do that blend right now though. I'll just kind of continuously apply a great amount of this. So I'm going to move over here, apply more highlight where I know it's needed. Move over here, apply more highlight where I know it's needed. Just get that pigment off of my brush. Soften this. And now you can see I'm not really applying pigment. I'm just applying a little bit of a lighter glaze, and now with this I can do that blend back that I wanted to. Just have it get lost in the darker portions of the cloud towards the left-hand side, creating that transition. And then this can be a bit more sharp and definitive. A little bit of a wash, make it brighter as a whole. Take out slight bits of contrast. Okay, and now everything should be dry, and we're going to move to the real highlights. That means more titanium white, less cerulean blue, but still a little bit, less Mars black, but still a little bit, mixing it right next to our previously brightest pigment, because, again, we should have that comparison, that contrast. We'll switch on over to the filbert initially, but we're also going to introduce a new brush in this step. I just want the primary base applied, and this is really the best brush to do it, as again, we have the opportunity, the option of working with a much softer application or a much heavier one. All of this is wet on a dry, which makes it a little bit less of a pristine blend, but as we talked about, it's really not a big deal with the clouds because we almost want that extra volume, right? We want that extra texture. I think this step does a lot for the painting. And this is something that we are going to need to build up over time. Our first layer isn't going to be as bright as we want it to be because we're not actually applying this pigment. Well, we're applying it, but it's not what we have on the canvas because that darker layer is still showing through. That's okay. Something we are going to, over time, build. I'm going to deviate a little bit from the reference photo here. So I create this other cloud, which is a little bit in front. I like that a lot. We have another one right here. And before we head over to the other side, let's actually switch to our liner brush. Make it nice and damp. And this one, as you can tell, very small. Great for the finer details. And that's what I want to start incorporating into some of these edges. I want bits of the cloud to stick out. And you're not going to see too much of this from that distance, but I do want you farther back purposefully just so you can see that while we're adding detail, we're not adding too much. And I will show you the actual application now as you move right there. So, as noted, we just grab that nice brighter value. We do little taps, pieces of the cloud breaking off. I'm using the body of the brush to do a little bit of a blend down as I do so. And again, little bits of cloud which are working their way up and off of the primary piece and movement here. Love painting clouds. It's one of those things where it can be in so many different shapes and volumes that you can't really do it wrong, right? You just create a different kind of cloud. And I think there's a real mental ease that comes with that. Everybody always looks at clouds and they say, oh, it looks like this or it looks like that. And the fact that it can look like so many different things and still be correct is great. Yet again, stepping back, we can see the real difference between a fairly complete cloud and a not so complete cloud, which we are going to work on right now. So I'm back with the highlight, I'm back to the filbert, we're back in the areas which are receiving the most light, which will have the greatest of highlights. Doing a bit of a blend down. That work its way up. There we are. Definitely need more for this, and I really like how this jets out into the sky. We almost have this leading line working its way down to the actual mountain because of it. And I'll let the highlight run out as we move towards the right hand side because I want the eye to, for the most part, stay towards the center of the canvas, and the eye will, as we know, innately go to the brightest point of any piece. So by keeping the majority of our bright applications in the center, we keep the eye right where we want it by that primary mountain, right? So, right now, sharp edges with fairly soft blends inward. Let's get you a bit closer as we build our highlights here. I'm not applying it over the entirety of the cloud that we've painted here because I want some areas to be a little bit darker for volume's sake. We need that contrast, we need that rolling of light. But here we can have it come down, and you can see that I'm also editing the shapes to a point. Here I'm actually just going to throw in a whole new cloud and another one right there. I like the set of 3, but I'm still building on it, right? We didn't just stop. With the first layers, we can still iterate. And now I think it's time to switch on over, not to the larger flat-headed brush, but to the liner brush. And for this, again, we'll have some clouds which reach out, have tiny protrusions, different mountainous shapes amongst the cloud itself. Okay, so we have quite a bit established, but there is still plenty more to apply along these edges. And this is something where I like to do a little bit, I like to take the steps back, kind of assess what it looks like from afar, make sure that I'm not adding too much detail, but also trying to articulate what areas need more. If you ever get to a spot where you feel like you've overdone it and they need less, you can also just kind of go back in with the sky or distant cloud color. That will help get you there. Just going to soften these darker values a little bit. Really easy to increase the values. As you can see, it's just a wash of the pigment we've been working with, add some extra water, and we get there pretty quickly, pretty easily. So this is an area I've been looking at for a long time, and I've wanted more detail on it. I knew we were going to get here, but I've been excited. So let's make this cloud something we can be proud of as well. We'll build on these. They can kind of connect through little pieces which break off. I'm not going to do too much detail on the right hand side because I don't want to bring that much attention to that corner of the painting. Remember, we're trying to focus inwards. And while I've worked on these areas before, I can now tell, after doing other areas, that I do want to go back to them and just touch them up. There we go. Okay, so stepping back, really like the clouds. I think that they, at this point, are in a place I'm very happy with. We can do additional highlights to them, we likely will, but for now, I'd like to start working on the mountain area. So for this, I'm going to break it down into areas that are somewhat highlighted, somewhat shadowed. There will be darker shadows, there will be brighter highlights, but also little patches of snow. And I'm going to start with the patches of snow just because it'll essentially help me break up the area visually and understand what I want to do further with the other mixtures. So for that, we're going to grab a hint of our Mars Black, titanium white. We're going to mix up a gray not as bright as what we have right here in the clouds. And we're also going to make it a little bit brighter than what we have for the darker portion. So it's in between. It also has a bit of blue because we are essentially reflecting that which is in the sky. Still working with a very limited palette, and I do like that. So now, I'm just going to use my brush to cut along our primary larger patches of snow. There will be a lot of individual markings of snow, very small. That will do with the liner brush later on in our process, but we do need to get the base layers of the actual rock mountain in first, and this is something we can do here before all of that. And again, this is about just defining shape, making our areas a bit more distinct. There we go. Mark that up there. Okay, let's get you a bit closer as we continue. Okay, so I'm actually going to switch brushes to the smaller flat-headed brush. Again, great for moving around a decent amount of paint. You get those sharp edges. You can just work with a bit more intended detail. And we'll do just that. Block in part of our mountain towards the top. We'll grab that same pigment and we'll have the snow work its way down the mountain. We'll have a bit of it over here. Not too much. And I think we'll head over here. And we'll do so by looking at this large area. You know what? I intended to use this. I am going to use this brush, but I am just going to use this to outline this big piece, this piece right here, what we have through here. And right now, as you can tell, this is all very thin. We will need to go back and do multiple layers, build it up. But for the actual filling in, I do think the larger flat-headed brush will just do a better job. Don't have to just paint with a singular brush at any given time. We can swap back and forth, make the process a lot quicker, and be kind of uncompromising in our applications. Sometimes when we try to do subject with the wrong brush, we can get it done, but it's not going to look as clean as it could. So here we're just making an effort. So admittedly, that looks pretty rough, but at this point it's meant to. It's just to help us figure out where things are going to go. And from there we can resume working on the mountains and the rest of it. So we're going to make a darker gray than we have before. This is going to not be as dark as it can get, but it's certainly going to be the darkest that we've done. And we'll also still use a bit of blue. I don't want too much, but we do need enough that we still have that cool atmospheric look. And we'll use this to start blocking in the portions of the mountain which will be a little bit brighter. And as you can see, I've sketched with some lines here into the darker areas. That's essentially going to be darker, that's going to be darker, everything to the left here will be darker, and everything else will have this. And this, while darker than everything we have on the canvas, is not going to be the darkest pigment we use, far from it. But we'll start blocking this in. We'll also go into it with a lot of details later on, which will brighten portions, add texture, really build the painting. Go back, grab some extra pigment. Still using the larger flat-headed brush because right now detail doesn't matter dramatically. I am valuing the sharp lines that I can render, but aside from that, I'm not too concerned about my applications. And the ability to just close these gaps is so cathartic. Here we are. You can see I'm rotating my brush in my hand. Get a better movement. And we'll bring that back down to the snow that will eventually line the bottom of the canvas. The mountain to the right, which we just avoided, is going to be a lot darker of a value than what we are currently working with. And that's why it's important that we ensure that this pigment right here isn't the darkest pigment that we have. That's why we incorporate the titanium white, the cerulean blue, and in the amount that we do. Move in a little bit closer, and as noted, this area right here is going to be darker, so we'll dodge that for now. Just work in the areas that I don't have shaded off. And we are going to lose some structural detail in this. As you can see, there are various lines. That's okay, we can always go back and redraw them. And I can already tell that I am going to want to do more layers. I'm making my brush fairly damp because I want to bring those bristles together. I want to create these incredibly sharp lines. That does come at the cost of thick pigment and additional layers. You can start to kind of see this in its form coming together. I'm going to change my stroke, work around our snow, like so. And again, here's where things will kind of accumulate visually to a point. As we start to bring these together. Now that we have the brighter areas done, we'll start working on something a little bit darker. We'll grab our Mars Black. I'll use some of the mix, as you can see, and work that in. Already it's evident that while this does look dark on the canvas, it was far from as dark as it could be, as this next mix is already much more so. And I'll actually incorporate a bit more blue into this darker mix because we'll have our shadows be a bit more cool as a whole. So I like this. I think just a hint more Mars Black and we'll be there. And this also, not the darkest mixture we could render. Look at this in comparison with the Mars Black. Again, it's dark compared to everything else, but there's still a lot more we could do with it, and that's very intentional. So from here, I'll start working in and around the openings and negative space for the rock, which it's not necessarily all in shadow. Some of the rock is just colored differently. That's pretty normal for rock. But we can also look at it as a shadowed hue for simplicity's sake. Just trying to find my drawing. I did go back and resketch it in to make my life a little bit easier. And in this, I know I'm going to lose a portion of my drawing. Some of these lines that are working fairly vertically, but that's okay. Already you can start to see this looking a lot better coming together. It's still just base layers. We don't have any depth yet. We don't have any gradients. We don't have any texture. But it's moving in the right direction. Alright. So don't get discouraged when the layers are initially looking a little flat and it's not exactly what you want. It's not meant to be. Not yet. You need to put in the time. You need to build it up. And we'll get there. You just need to trust the process. Really do love painting mountains, clouds. I think this is probably some of my favorite subjects to work on. And every time we have an opportunity to put them in the same piece, very happy. I think there's just something so natural about painting these very hard line structures with the flat-headed brushes and the clouds with the filbert. the contrast of the hard lines and the soft, the wispy details and the climbing. Blocky rock. We'll have the cloud essentially rolling over this part of the mountain. So I think we'll just create a bit of a soft edge here so that it's easier to move the cloud over it. We don't have a definitive hard edge. It'll just make our life a bit easier in later steps. You can also blend it with a filbert. It will be easier to blend with a filbert. I'm just fairly confident with this. There we go. And now we'll just continue. Getting really excited for the details. I think we're going to make a dramatic change to this very quickly once we do start to interject those. Also just placing in some rock down here. The majority of this is snow, but we are going to have some rock. There we go. We'll also take this and we can start defining some extra pattern. Movements. We don't need to keep these, but they are essentially going to imply the movement that we do need to create. Just looking for the areas in the reference photo and in the painting that look like they would have an area that would have a bit of shadow. It'd have that fissure-like effect. And therefore, this little bit of shadow makes sense. Alright, so stepping back, starting to get some of our structure, that's good. I'm going to do a second layer over a lot of this, just because it is acrylics, because it is fairly thin, and I'm going to make the second layer just slightly brighter for both of our values. So yet again, I'm just blocking things in. This isn't a real change of value. Dramatically, it isn't meant to change the structure of the piece. It's just meant to have more thick pigment. And I recommend you do the same. It also gives you an opportunity to make a minor tweak in the hue and the value. Make sure it's what you really want it to be. And it'll go fairly quickly as you already have a lot of it established. So I'm just going to finish doing this. And then once I have my second layers applied, you and I will jump back into a new step, okay? There we go. Now the second layer is applied and fully dry. As you can see, I didn't change any of the line work where any of the values were. It was really just more pigment to make it so we couldn't see the white of the canvas underneath like we can kind of with the snow, though we will fix that as well. From here, I want to go back to this pigment, and as you can see, it's still on my palette, so easy to remix, refined. We'll just make a good amount, make it less blue, make it a bit darker. We're getting closer, but I want it this time to be slightly brighter than what we just had. I want to be able to build small textural highlights, small surfaces which protrude, catch extra light. We'll move away slightly from the cerulean blue in the mix. Because we are working in a lighter area, we're saving the more cerulean blue heavy areas for the shadows. We'll switch over to our liner brush. And with this, again, it should be brighter, just a little bit, and it is. Okay, good. So with this, I'm just creating these linear markings, and while technique I like it, I do want the actual pigment to be a bit brighter and a little bit less blue. By just adding titanium white, we do make it brighter, and we also make it less blue because the titanium white desaturates the cerulean blue in the mix. Now we'll try this. There we go. I'm going to create all of these mini markings which run down the mountain in different ways. Sometimes they'll be elongated and speckled. Sometimes it'll be a series of almost rectangular systems spawning randomly or from a given point. Through here, towards the top, make it a bit more blocky. And if you accidentally add too much, you need not worry, because we can always go back in with the darker hue of the mountain and re-interject that. So something I'm doing is I'm starting with smaller markings, and then I'm slowly adding more and amalgamating. Also, I'm trying to move with a lot of the actual bodies of rock. So here we can see that there are a lot of brush strokes that go down this way, so I'm following that. And then here we can see that there's a movement up here. It's a bit triangular, right? And I'm accentuating that with these markings. This isn't snow, it's just highlighted rock. So I'm trying to keep it within some level of structure rather than just a tapped flurry of snow or a larger sitting body. Don't want to go too high there, lose your view. Then we have a lot of elongated ones towards the bottom, which is good. It's going to give us a sense of a real climb, a real steepness. I'm working around all of the darker areas I implied with the larger flat-headed brush when I took some of this pigment and I moved it over here. Then we can double down on some of the areas up here that we like. The more I do this, the more I realize I do want to amalgamate markings. But now when we look at that in contrast with the adjacent mountains, see a big difference, right? Does a lot for the painting. And we're going to do more layers exactly like this with different values, slightly different hues. There we go. So here we have a highlight, we have a mid value, we have a darker value. And we'll iterate so that we have many of all of which. I'm starting to like it. Again, acrylics innately will have rough phases. That's okay. It's part of the job. It's part of the process. If we just trust that when we put in that time, that effort, we will get to where we want to be, we'll make that happen. That's exactly what we're doing. This is all incredibly watery. That's partially so that it's more transparent and more subtle. That is something I want here. It's partially so that I get a really sharp line. Again, very elongated markings that are here. So at this point, I am starting to like it. We just integrated all of those details in here. It's time to do so in the darker portions. As you can see, I've reintegrated a couple of lines just to give myself a little bit of idea of structure. That was again just from the traceable, but we are going to remix the darker pigment that we used here. Still have a bit of it on my palette, and intentionally so. Remember, we can use more blue in this area because it's a bit darker. And with this, I'm actually going to go a little bit lighter than what I currently have. Not dramatically so, not as bright as what we have here or in the highlight of it, but just a little bit. And remember, we're not going to be applying this pigment. We're going to be applying the pigment that is this, slightly transparent with this underneath. So it'll be darker than what I mix. And that's a good thing to keep in mind. With that, switching over to the liner brush, the actual application process, I think I'll start over here just because it'll give me a definitive area to finish up, and I like that. It'll just aid us if we have a bit of a completionist mind or reward structure. So here I'm doing essentially the same thing where I'm saying, okay, how does this area of the mountain move down? It's on this slant. Okay, so we make markings for the most part that are in that slant. Occasionally things are going to move over because we're going to have different protrusions and structures. But for the most part, we work in those directions. And just like that, I think it looks a lot more full. We can double down on the areas that we really like, make them a bit brighter by just doing a second layer and application. I'm also doing little taps here and there to integrate that textural rocky look. Well, let's get closer for this. So, getting closer, we see this line. Let's start mirroring it to a point. Let's run this down to about here, and then maybe I'll create, you see this divot, so I create that horizontal piece. And then from there, we can move down on more of this slant, which is seen right here. I like that. Connect it into the previous applications, and then we go for a much more steep dive again. We can go over portions multiple times, brighten them up, make it a bit more intentional. and then for that fall. Sometimes there's even a little bit of a almost rounded application. It's rare, but it happens. It's one of those tools that you don't want to overuse, but you do want to use here and there. Then I think this will open up and be a bit more of a triangular space. Perhaps it has a greater highlight as a whole. It's facing the light a bit more. Not as much as these areas, but certainly more. And just because we're making this flat and less detailed doesn't mean that in the end it will be flat and less detailed. It just means that we'll probably apply more of our highlights of this on top of it a little bit later on. Now, a lot of this is quite easy. It's almost like a giant, somewhat rotated rectangle. And these areas, while it is important that we are mindful of our details and our applications, a lot of this is going to be covered up by snow. Very small textured snow, but snow nonetheless. And it's just good that we have some movement through this spot. From here, we'll continue working left, though all of my pigment has dried. So we'll just remix that. Again, we have it on our palette, not easy to find, especially with such a limited palette. It's easy to keep track of where your values and hues are for each part of the painting. So we'll just mix that up. Grab our liner brush. And with this, we have a couple of different movements, but a lot of these rocks are moving down this way, and then we essentially get to a spot where it starts to move this way. So they converge down here, but I'll start, for simplicity's sake, over in a new spot. And we'll create those lines that are, for the most part, vertical, but also definitely have a leaning trajectory. And so when these two meet, you feel like there's a divide between them because there isn't a connection of pattern, and the lines move opposite to each other. So it's really quite simple in that. It's nice. Here we have a very awkward snow, but that's okay. We will remedy that fairly soon. And I'm also going to do a lot of little taps towards the bottom just to separate it. When we do the elongated strokes, typically that's a good indicator that something is essentially moving on a very similar trajectory. Right? So when something's quite elongated, either vertically or horizontally, but once we get into more of a staggered area of rock, so perhaps it's going down towards the bottom, there's an up and down, that's where I make it more of a tap, a little bit of a tap and a drag, rather than an elongated drag. So that's what we're doing down here. I'm also doing taps just all about. And then as we move into this area, we continue. For the most part, there's elongated movements. I'm going to make these slightly more vertical, so I'm consistently making changes through each area in terms of the general movements, but I'm also just looking out for these unique spots as well, because the snow and the way it sits will also dictate how a lot of this is represented visually. we're back to moving in this direction. Over here on the right hand side. And you can see that I get a lot quicker with my applications as we continue, because we just know what we're doing at this point. We've had opportunity to warm up, to get familiar with the process, and it all just starts to come together not only on the canvas but in our mind. And when it's together in our mind, once we have that direction, it's so much easier. Right now I'm going back and I'm amalgamating areas. Just like that. Stepping back, I think we're in a good place, and right now I actually want to go back to the highlight that we used for our mountain, make something slightly brighter, and just bring that up a bit before we jump into the snow, which is going to add the majority of detail and texture to the painting. We're almost there. So, liner brush for our application, nice and damp. Going to apply this in the most prominent areas that are receiving light. So the top of the mountain. And I'm going to, for the most part, be revisiting previous highlights. So I know you're far away. You might be wondering where exactly I'm applying this. It's over areas that we've already spent a good amount of time on. And I'm not doing this to all of the mountains. I'm doing this to the ones that I really want visual emphasis on. And this one in the center is really that primary subject, right? Still amalgamating. Bringing those highlights in. Can also do little taps, as we did throughout, especially in the staggered areas, but those taps are predominantly going to be visually useful when the snow comes in. So I don't want to do too much of that early on. And we're essentially building these layers up like vectors. Taking a step back, like that. It's very watery, so that it's not too opaque, so that I get these sharp markings. Maybe we'll do, I don't really want to do any over here, to be honest. Now we can have some fun with that snow. So we're not going to start in the primary mountain here because I want to warm up with the technique before we do that deep dive. So we're actually going to start over here, and we have a pigment established for the snow already on our palette. We'll essentially remix that, and we'll mix a good amount of it because we're going to have a lot of snow. Make it nice and thick. The titanium white will help greatly in that. You can see that I'm just slowly spreading it out. We'll do a little test. We found the pigment. Pretty perfect. Back over to, you guessed it, the liner brush. And with this, I'm going to start in some of the areas that already have snow, because we know definitively that these areas need to be done, and we don't have to question how it'll all balance in the end because we know it's definitive, right? So I like to do lots of little taps with some elongated markings. Every area we add snow is essentially somewhat of a flat surface, an area where snow can be collected, right? And I'm trying to find the highlighted areas in a lot of cases, and then establish snow on top of them. So we're still making use of those somewhat rough, flat applications from the beginning. And I will go over my past applications of snow just in case my mixture is a little bit different in hue or value. And here it looks like the snow is kind of pooling in between these two peaks, which I like a lot. I'm going to follow the reference photo to a good degree, but I'm also open to making changes and editing it for balance's sake, for composition's sake, for feeling's sake. And already, I think if we look at this mountain in contrast with that, there's a big difference. This is also, for me at least, the most fun part. I hope you get to really feel that too. Painting snow is just such a treat. A lot of this is. It's, again, subjects where it's difficult to make them look wrong or incorrect, just because there's so much natural variance in them. Here I'm making some lines of snow that are a bit more horizontal. It's a unique look. Then we have quite a bit that's diagonal through here. And I'll connect some, make this a bit bigger than it was in the reference photo. Just because I do want these to be pretty snowy. Again, we start with the mandatory applications, the mandatory areas, the areas that we do know work, that we do like in the photo. And then we expand and we elaborate. Yeah, I'm going to make this one much more snowy than it is in the reference. Then we'll of course have to do a little bit down here just to balance it. I think we can also do some through there. Starting to get the hang of it. You can see this also adds a lot of dimension and direction to the mountains themselves, which is important. Going back and sharpening lines. As I do this, I tend to run out of paint and then it becomes a bit more watery and we don't have the definitive markings that look great on the snow. We have direction and we have a new foundation, we have a new base layer, and that's great and it's worth doing. But when we do that, we should probably go back and just build it up slightly more, as I'm working to do right now. So now we have that little area that comes down. Didn't have that before. We can have another one here, but we don't want to make them too similar. So make the drop off a bit more steep. There's another brush we can do to incorporate the tappings, and we will get that later in the lesson. But don't feel like you have to do all of them right now. It's actually better to do slightly less of everything right now. That way we can see the entirety of the painting and then bring it together. bring everything almost to an 80% completion, and then we complete the painting as a whole at the end. Once we know how we want to balance it correctly. There we go. Starting to get to some realism. This also isn't our final application of the snow. The snow itself will get better. Just trying to figure out where I want to continue from. Right now, we have a lot of option as you move over into our more prominent mountain. And with the larger mountain comes larger surface area. So more areas to add snow, elaborate on snow, break off snow. Do all of the fun little techniques that we're doing. You can see really through here that I'm going in and I'm doing that next layer. I'm redefining the edges of our first application we did forever ago. It's making a really big difference. Trying to be a little bit loose with it, but mindful of my general goal. Doing slightly less snow towards the top because I like the contrast of the darker hues, darker values. Yeah, I like that. And in the areas that are a bit more steep and undefined, we move to taps. That way we get texture, we get snow. But we don't necessarily have areas where it's sitting until we want them. Like one right here. Maybe one right here. And once you create these shelves, we can create little areas that the snow can run down. So if I'm getting a little quiet, it's easy to just get lost in this process and happily do little bits of problem solving, you know? Okay, so from here, I'm just going to move on over. And as I noted earlier, a lot of this is kind of slanting down in this direction. We have this larger body of snow, which we will fill in, but we're also going to extend it somewhat dramatically into these other pockets, and they will extend. That snow will fall off areas that have a great deal of it, and it'll kind of work upwards, connect with this one, which we will make thicker over a couple of layers. But we're essentially continuing similar practices, trying to get as sharp of a marking as we can. And I think where a lot of the magic happens with the snow is a little bit later towards the bottom, because we have that snow running up the mountain, right? We'll get there soon. We will. I think the more we start amalgamating, the more it feels full and natural. This isn't in the reference photo, but I think if we build up this area, it'll also look pretty great. There we go. Little areas that protrude and stick out. Catch extra snow. Lead back to the mountain through the horizontal lines. Love that. Now as I continue to move over, I'm actually going to switch to the smaller flat-headed brush to block in some of these larger areas yet again. I think that as we proceed, I want more and more to really accentuate the snow, make it brighter as a whole, but we've started with this darker bluish hue, and this will make a great base. So I'm committed, but we are definitely going to make this pop out. You can see how quickly this goes on with the flathead brush. We don't get as much detail, but we can still get those sharp lines. We can still be intentional with our mark making. And that in itself is really a big part of this. Said, my brush is starting to dry. I don't have as much water on it as I need to keep the bristles together. So I'm just trying to get the majority of this thick pigment off. Now we'll grab some water, grab some extra paint, and it's back to being nice and easy. Snow's just working its way down. Then here we have a mountain kind of cut across. Take a little bit of a break from this brush, switch back to the liner, make it nice and damp, but I still want enough paint where this is going to go on in a fairly opaque way. Find the areas of highlight that work themselves into this larger body. That way we have it look like it's falling onto the next piece of landmass effectively. I think I'll also start doing a couple horizontal areas of snow as well. Again, building those shelves. Yeah, once we go in with our highlight, this is going to look great. I'm excited. I think this is something that I actually want to extend to the bottom. Again, creative, artistic liberties, but ones that add up and have real value. Now, stepping back, I think the left-hand side is starting to come along. However, I realized when I did step back, I didn't actually finish this area through here. So I just want to take a second, go back, add some extra pigment. And this will happen a lot, where we work on another area, we take that step back, we look at our painting as a whole, and we realize, you know what, I could have done more there, or should have done more there. And that's a good thing. It shows us that we are figuring out the piece as a whole, balance as a whole. So, just going to go back in, thicken some layers, build out more snow where it's needed, and then we can head back to the smaller flathead. And this area has a lot of snow to it. Again, this is one where it's kind of protruding a little bit. Lock in the bodies of the snow. Continuously grabbing more water and pigment. And here we can actually start to establish the base. And this will give you an idea of how it'll actually start coming together fairly soon. But we have a lot of snow in here. Pigment is incredibly thin. We definitely need 2, maybe 3 layers right in this area, but for the sake of blocking, you can see what that looks like. Let's get you a bit closer. You know what? While we're playing with the blocking of the bottom, let's just do it. Let's go in with the larger flat-headed brush. And again, like everything else, just a base layer. We are applying paint with the intention of building texture and various values, but we do need a starting point, and that's what we are applying right now. Happens nice and quick with this brush. I'm not going to the edges as I apply the larger base because I don't have a lot of water on the brush for the sake of getting a very thick pigment, and with that I don't have as much control as I'd like to around sharper edges. I don't have the ability to render anything incredibly clean and intentional. So right now I'm just going over the areas that are nice and big. I can avoid edges. I can just put a lot of paint on the canvas. Now we will wet our brush, grab some pigment, and this is where we can start working on that bottom. I like to do a bit of a tapping motion as I work into the sometimes crevices, sometimes highlights. It's also good to occasionally have a bit of a rounded section. It's not all the time, but that variance can be pretty beautiful. Almost like a more rounded approach in the crevices, in the darker areas, and then the tap upwards, like so. And I think that really adds a lot to the base, right? Even without detail, even without a change in value or volume, even without making it look three-dimensional, yet still pretty valuable visually. Now, still using that brush, still fairly damp, and we're doing a pretty good job of making our way upwards. Lots of little taps. I know you're fairly far away, but that is intentional right now. We're working on something that connects a lot of the painting together. And it's just more valuable to see the painting as a whole, I think, than it is to see the individual mark making, because you've seen the mark making, you know the patterns. This is about bringing it together. Okay. You will also do a couple little horizontal areas of snow. Then we'll get you closer. Now, we just did a lot of work with the larger flat-headed brush, so we are going to return to the trusty little liner. And here we will define the edges that we started with our flathead. This means making edges sharper, thicker, continuing to define form, finding all of the little edges that may protrude and then have snow falling down onto rock. Also doing lots of little taps. That'll be quite important, especially towards these bottom areas that raise up into the rock. I think that right there is a brilliant example of what can be. The right applications and care. A lot of it starts as a line, then it turns into taps. There aren't definitive rules here. You know, I talked about how a lot of the darker areas I like to do the smoother, rounded application, and then I like to do the taps kind of moving up highlighted situations like this. And that for the most part is true, but it's not always going to be true. There we are. Okay, so once the majority of our canvas is dry to the touch, we're going to start working on a highlight for us now. And we can do that really anywhere on our palette. Everything is dry for the most part, but I want something brighter than this. I still want it to have the blue in it, but I do want it to be a bit more gray because we're moving away from the shadows themselves and we're moving into a bit more light. So, we're still incorporating the cerulean blue, we're just doing less of it. Certainly more titanium white, a little bit more Mars black. And I really love this pigment. So, a couple of ways to apply this, but it's important that we start, I think, in the larger bodies of snow. And I'm going to be a little bit rough with this. I'm going to do taps, I'm going to do drags, I'm going to try to create some level of inconsistency in the application. That way it looks like there's some mounds of snow which are larger than others. A little bit heavier, catching more light. And it's just going to build some perceived textural depth very easily. And we're going to splash this throughout our painting. Though, as bright as it is on the palette, as you can see, not so much on the actual canvas. And, oh, my alarm is going off. It's apparently time to wake up. Got up a little earlier today to do some painting. But, as I was mentioning, quite bright on the palette, but it's not that dramatic on the canvas. That means we have room to brighten it yet again, which is fun. Though I'm not going to do that with all of the snow. I'm going to try to keep the majority of the brightening a bit more central. That way we can bring the eye and the viewer's attention inwards. And by going over it multiple times, we do build those highlights. So, we're back with layer number 3. And also grab our larger flat-headed brush, make sure it's a bit damp. I'm going to head into the bottom. See just how stark it is there. I'm going to work my way up, but my pigment, as you know, is fairly dry. So we're going to make our brush extremely wet. I'm going to take off the vast majority of our paint, and we'll do a wet into dry blend upwards. We'll have it dissipate as we work towards the mountain. Do little taps up. Though before all of these taps that move upwards dry, I do want to go back over them again with a line work that matches the movement of the snow. So eventually it'll all pool. You can see there are soft blends. You can see that it's darker at the top, and intentionally so. Now it looks like we have extra light at the bottom, and it's working its way up, right? It's really the goal for a lot of this. Building that light. And in these larger areas, we can even do it with this big flat-headed brush. Just creating more texture. Line work, this is incredibly thin pigment. It doesn't have to be, but it is helping me with the blending. There we go. Let's go a little bit brighter. Work that into the bottom. We'll get closer with the flat-headed brush. Build some highlights towards the top. Leave some openings. This is where it starts to feel a bit more right. Love working on these slightly more flat surfaces. Always think that's fun. It's just so definitive. Head on over here. More light at the top. Will dissipate as you work our way down. We're almost at the point where we can start working with our new brush, because we're going to add a lot of detail very quickly. We just needed to layer this foundation to get there. We're almost at that point. Remember that it should dissipate for the most part as we move down. Just running out of pigment, slowly but steadily. And we don't do as much highlight over on the edges, but we do some, because we need it to still be three-dimensional, still make sense within the context of the painting as a whole, just not stand out quite as much. Okay, and now, likely, just one more time, we're going to look at that highlighted mix. We're going to go slightly brighter. We're going to go slightly less blue. And this right here, it's definitely brighter, it's definitely less blue. Might be slightly too much so I'll just re-interject into that titanium white. Switch on over to the smaller flat. We'll grab that, we'll apply, recognizing that our brush is damp, our pigment is semi-opaque. We're not going to have something incredibly bright long term. It'll look a little bit brighter as it's wet, as acrylic tends to, before it dries, but here we're scaling the mountain with our highlights. Always a fun task. And this is, I would say, dramatically brighter as we continue through the mountain, as we see more examples of it. So what I really want to do is I want to take a step back after I do a reasonable portion to give it an accurate assessment, and make sure that this is actually the correct value for proceeding forward. Might be a little bit too bright, it might not be bright enough. We don't know until we establish a fair amount. Step back, we give it that accurate, fair assessment. I think that's enough to tell. So take those steps back and I love it. Okay. Oh, wonderful when that happens. Okay. Not even an elongated question. We can just tell essentially immediately that this is what we were looking for. But because we have the darker underlayers, it pops in a wonderful way. We needed to build those layers. We needed to build that contrast. We did. And now it pays off. We trusted the process. Now we're really finding our way. I haven't even started to work in with the smaller brush yet. This is all just with the smaller flat. When we get to the liner, we get to the details of these highlights. That'll be special. Starting to see the implications of that right here as I make my more minute markings, less pressure with the brush. Trying to find the areas that horizontally protrude. Make sure that they are well taken care of. And we also need this towards the bottom, which is going to look incredibly dramatic initially. It's okay. Working my way up the edges. It's going to be a lot of weaving towards the bottom. So there are openings. Probably going to blend the bottom portion of the weavings while keeping the top portion a bit sharper. So I'll make a move like that, I'll blend the bottom, I'll make another one, I'll blend the bottom, I'll make another one, I'll blend the bottom. Sometimes I'll make a lot of those movements, and then I'll start blending the bottoms afterwards. And a lot of this starts by finding the brightest point in the area that reaches on the mountains, moving upwards with that, and then finding the natural point at the bottom where that snow starts to collect and build a bit. Now you're pretty far away. Let's get you a bit closer. Okay. Back to our pigment. Looks a lot brighter initially. Remember that as this dries, it will not be that bright. I'm not afraid to go over areas multiple times. Even if I like them, if I feel like the highlight needs to be built up, we are building it up. I think a lot of us, when we start painting and we render areas that we really love, we get worried that we'll ruin them. And then we stop painting, we stop building the layers, when it could be a lot better if we just a little bit more paint on the canvas. So that's one thing I really would implore you to do. It's just add that paint more. And I always get the question, how do you know when a painting's done? How do you know when you're finished? And for me, in a lot of cases, I like to overdo it. I like to overwork the painting, do too many applications, build it up too much, make it just to that point where I know I need to work it back. And then I do work it back, and then I've seen the painting at two stages. I've seen it when it doesn't have enough paint, I've seen it when it has too much paint, and therefore I know that its completed version is somewhere in the middle. And I've been there, right? So I just have to work back and find it while I do little critiques and figure out what areas I love the most, what's worth keeping, right? But I think that's a really good way of going about it. There we go. I think that's quite nicely. Got not much over here, but we'll do a little bit. I might actually redo this entire area. I don't know yet. I really deviated from the reference photo, and I don't know that I prefer what I did. Okay, so we step back. I think that it is by far the best it's been. Very happy about it. There's more to do, especially with the details, and for those we are going to switch to the fan brush. Now this is a fairly stiff bristled fan brush. It's from my set, and if you make it wet, it will condense, it will fork. You'll get 4 or 5 bristles, which I love for foliage. For this though, we want to keep it dry so that we have all of those individual bristles, great for tapping, building detail. I'm going to grab that highlighted pigment on our brush. We don't want too much, but we want a fair amount. And we're going to find the areas that come up from the snow. There's that drop down from the snow. And we're going to also apply it into the middle of the snow. And this is going to give us so much detail, so much texture that just wouldn't be realistic to accomplish with any other brush, because even with the liner brush, despite the fact that it's small, you're still working with dozens, if not hundreds of bristles touching the canvas simultaneously. Where with this, each individual bristle is making a marking and it's having an impact. So let's get you a bit closer and we'll add some real detail together. As you can see, I've just started right there. You saw me make those markings. Let's do so right through here. You can hear it a little bit. Just have these nice little dotted textures. Going to try to show you this from a lot of different distances. That way you can really see the level of variance, the level of detail from, a foot away, but also feet away. Because we don't look at paintings from half a foot away in rooms, do we? Not often. Typically quite far, and it's important to recognize what that looks like and to paint for that as well. At least know how to, right? Painting's so subjective. What you like, how you like to paint. I don't like to think that there's a right or wrong in any of it. I like to think it's a personal preference thing, but I like to set you up with the skills and the ideas and the techniques, mindsets, to ensure that whatever you want to paint, however you want to paint it, you can do that. Whether that's for a very intimate, close viewing or something that does stand out better in a room. There are balances. There are compromises. But really just adding this for the most part in our pre-established highlights to begin with. Oh, this area is so much better now. Really needed this. Remember when we were just blocking it in? I was telling you it doesn't look great, but we trust the process and we get there. We trust the process. I think we've just about gotten there. We can go back and further refine this a little bit later on. Using our liner brush, we won't be able to get as definitive markings, but we will be able to clean things up if this gets a little messy. It's also worth noting that in the context of still trying to be somewhat intentional with our mark making, I'm not often pressing the entirety of the brush into the canvas. For the most part, it's much more akin to about a third of the brush, and then I'll rotate and I'll use the other third because that will have paint on it. Eventually the paint will start to dry on the brush. Eventually you'll run out of paint. In that scenario, I am going to clean my brush because it's happening to me right now. Things are getting sticky, my markings are getting bigger. I'm going to clean my brush. I'm going to dry it well because I do want to be able to go back in with a very sharp marking. I don't want the condensed bristles. Not right now anyway. And then we'll continue adding our snow. So here we are, up close, yet again. Fresh pigment, an opportunity to render some very intentional mark making. You can even do this with a less highlighted pigment initially, if you want to really put some time into your painting. I think the more layers of various values in mountains and snow often results in a great piece. I can only do so many because I'm filming it and I don't want this video to be 8 hours for you. But you could put that extra time in and it really would add a lot. It's always my hope that while I make these lessons, you can take them, take the ideas, interject more time, spend more time painting it than I do, and improve on different things. You know, we have a Facebook group for all of the Patreon members, and it always makes me smile quite widely when I see people iterating on the paintings, making them better, because I find that inspiring. I feel like that makes me want to go out and paint, to adopt the ideas of the community and just continue to make even better paintings and even better lessons for everybody. I think that's always the goal, right? We're working with each other to improve each other. I guess while we're talking about Patreon, well, at first, let me get you a little bit farther back because I know that I'm incredibly close and I feel like I might just be too close to really assess how much of this I should be doing in this area. So 1 second. Okay, so I intended to take a step back to add further details, but I ended up taking out some snow from this area. We've talked about it a couple of times. I felt like it just deviated slightly more than what I wanted it to, and we could make it better by being a bit reductive with the application. I thought, you know what, this is an important thing to show you. So I have remixed the darker pigment that we used for the base, and what I do is I just start to work in the snow. In a lot of cases it's with a tapping motion. That way I keep that textured look that we have over there, and I just slowly remove that which we have. I try to go in with something fairly opaque. I don't want it to look muddy, I don't want it to look dirty. I'm looking for fairly definitive applications and markings. Like so. You can use really any brush to do this. It's dependent on the area, your comfort level, how much snow you want to remove, what you want to keep, right? There we go. And I like to do this even in some of the more snow-dense areas, here and there. If things look a little bit flat or mundane, this is a great way of playing with that, fixing it up. You don't need to do too much. We can even work it down on the snow, should we want to. Okay, good. So from there, let's get back to some highlights. For this, we of course are returning to our larger flat mixing brush, Cerulean blue, Mars black. This area has become quite large, so it's easy to mix on top of and still see the pigment we're working towards in the surrounding areas. Always really value that. And switch over to our fan brush. Start creating that texture, and that was part of the reason I really wanted to clean this up. I thought the texture in this area was so beautiful in the photo, and we just wouldn't be able to capture that, render it, translate it, if we had all of that abundant snow still showing in this space. I wanted more unique, tiny textural taps. And they were covering a good portion of it, to be honest. But we have that contrast, we have that detail now. And I think it just looks a whole lot better. Also going to add a little bit through here. Here we are from a bit farther away, just to make sure we don't overdo it. But much like this area, I do want more through here. And of course you bring that into the bottom. Starting to amalgamate in all of the ways that we wanted to. And we'll jump around a little bit. Okay. So I am heading back, continuing to build up those lighter hues in the areas we need them, and adding some finite markings to the random applications that we had, or the somewhat random applications that we had with the fan brush. And it's really going back and forth that'll get us to the best place with this. But you know what? I pulled it back so that we could look at it as a whole. I think we should probably get closer again. 1 second. Okay, here we are. Now, as I think we were talking about, being inspired by other people's work and the Facebook group we have for the Patreon community, did think I'd mention a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for making these lessons happen. For the most part, this channel is community funded up there, and it's because of you that these longer lessons, these real-time dub lessons can exist. I know that they're not always the best for the algorithm, but I know that I personally really like longer in-depth tutorials, and I appreciate everybody up there making these something that's actually viable to make. And if you're new to the channel, if it's your first time here, and you're unaware, up over on Patreon you can get the traceables, so all of the canvas with the line art, so you can print that off or use a projector or do one of the many different ways of transferring that. I also upload the reference photos, images of all of the paints and materials, so you know you're working with exactly the same stuff that I am. You can also get, I think, over 100 bonus lessons. I think it's over 100. That I don't have up here on YouTube. We also have really big 24 by 36 inch painting lessons. So if you want to work something much larger than this, incorporate a lot more detail and do that deep dive, they're typically a 5 to 8 part series. A lot of fun. There are a number of those. Up there you can also get access to all my ebooks, which include Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials. Teaches you everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting. Talk about composition, palettes, brushes, how to work with water, glazing, all of that good stuff. There are also ebooks full of traceables. Up at that same tier, you can get your name at the end of the video as a producer. And again, it's just a great way to support the channel if you can. But if not, it's okay too. Just happy you're here, watching the channel, being a part of the community. There we go. I think all of this added tapped texture is actually doing a lot. You can see I'm adding some more unique movements to the rock there. Sometimes it's a pretty soft transition downwards, and I do try to dispel that and make it a bit more unique. Kind of have this area that wraps around the mountain. Just trying to make different spots different from that which they're adjacent to. That way it's continuously interesting, and when somebody looks at one part of it, they don't feel like they've seen or understood all of it. And we have some of that bright snow working its way down. All right. There we go. Now I'll take a step back, and I want to recreate this cloud color because I want to move portions of that cloud down and over our mountain. So this was, for the most part, titanium white, a little bit of Mars black, a little bit of cerulean blue. We'll try our best to match that. A little bit darker, extra Mars black. We use small amounts each time because it can have a big impact. Much closer, needs a bit more blue, needs to be cooler. So we're just making micro adjustments. And I like that. Okay, so I'm not going to apply it with this large flathead brush. I'm actually going to switch back over to the filbert because of the nice round head. We're going to work our way down some of the crevices of the mountain. We can let this be somewhat semi-transparent, but on the edge we want a good transition that's fairly soft. And then I'll just do a little bit of a blend, make it softer as you move down. Now it feels like that. It's just moving over. I think I need a hint more blue in the mix. It needs to be slightly cooler. Yeah, that's so much better. Okay. Let's continue to layer from that top area. Now that we're starting to lose this cloud, that's okay, we can repaint it. Now my hand's kind of in the way for some of this, and I do apologize. It's just one of those things where just we need to be right there. Let's make it a bit brighter. We'll build out this cloud, give it a bit of a new body. This one too, just a little guy. like so. Have that roll off. Oh, it feels much more three-dimensional, doesn't it? Have that one kind of going over there. There are different values, there's different amounts of light, there are different shapes, and that's really the larger goal through all of that. At this point, I think I like it a lot. I think I like the background. We might go through with another pass of highlights, but I think it's time to start working on here and here. So we're essentially back to the block-in process here. Going back to the larger flat-headed brush, we are going to render some of our snow, very similar color to that which we already have here. A little bit darker than that, but not by much. And we'll mix up a good amount because we do have a fairly large area to work in. Might go a little bit less blue than we normally do because we're closer to us, so we get less of that atmospheric light, but it still is cool. We still will have some, so there is an incorporation. And with this, we'll just block in this fairly unique shape. We have snow running down the edge of this mountain, and it finds its way off into the almost body of the other. And then we have this almost patchy area right through there. Next, we go over here, and we have a lot to work on. So we'll just fill this out. You can see I'm rotating my brush so that I frequently have the sharp end of the brush, that larger head on the edge of wherever we are painting. And we can actually make this a little bit bigger. And then we have more down here. We have a line, snow, which will be broken up. And this is all fairly messy. That's okay. I know we've gotten to a stage in a painting where we are moving into more of the concrete, intentional applications, and that's fun and it's very rewarding, but we are now reminding ourselves that that's not how paintings start, and that's okay. It's a little rocky, it's a little rough, and then we figure it out, and it turns out well. Here's going to be fairly unique. Different snow. I'm going to cover up the majority of this actually, but I do want some hints of it showing through just for my drawing's sake. Yeah, okay, I like that. Next. Let's go for a much darker hue. Darkest pigment we've mixed thus far. This will be for the rock here in the foreground. Still going to have some blue in it, but not much. And if we put this next to our previous darks, it should substantially be more. This is probably a little bit too dark for this side. Maybe we can use it on this side, but hint of titanium white. It's still far darker than anything else we've used. Yes, and this is perfect. Okay, so as you can see, roughly painting this in. There we go. Some bigger blocking. And stepping back, I actually really love that hue in relation to everything else. It feels cold, feels like rock, it complements. Let's extend that over here. I'm going to start by working the edges while I have the wet brush ability to make sharp markings. Need a bit more water. Still trying to keep my hand out of the way, but when we're traversing this amount of space on the canvas, it's difficult to find a spot where I will continuously be behind sight lines properly. So bear with me. Some very unique structural pieces here. I like that. Quite noticeable in the reference photo. Then we'll work this around. I do some light taps around portions of this. Not all of it, but I'm just trying to make it look like the rock is scattered. The snow is not evenly put on like a blanket. We don't have that much snow. We have some snow, but we don't have that much. You know, now that we're kind of locked into a certain area, let's get you a bit closer. As we continue. As we progress and continue. Okay. Now we'll continue blocking. Again, the majority of this I did want to lose, but we'll do so little bit by little bit. Just hints of blue and snow for us to work on later. Alright, so we have that large area just about complete. Now we have another area right here that kind of protrudes a bit, and I want that to be slightly darker, just a little bit. As we get closer and closer to us, we get darker and darker. So adding extra Mars Black into the mix, not a dramatic amount more, but more. And we can have that blend with our previous pigment down here at the bottom. Grab a bit of water so that we can continue to apply this properly. Again, it looks rough right now. That's okay. Meant to be that way. Just part of the process. So let's get a little bit darker again for this last little stretch. Much more pitter patter down here. And then we finish covering the final portion of our canvas. That's always fun. We have a lot of work left to do, but it's nice to see full coverage. Okay, now we'll get in close here and create some slightly highlighted areas of rock. And we'll just use our same 3 pigments. We're going for a little bit of a more gray version than our last pigment, but we want it to be subtly so. Not looking for a dramatic change at all. The dramatic look will come in the form of our snow. Now we'll grab this with our liner brush, and we can just create some movements of rock, areas that protrude, catch extra light. And I want to do a lot of it with a tapping motion. Like so. We're not going to apply it everywhere, but we're just focusing on where we can add snow, where we can build. It's a pretty wispy application for the most part. But when we step farther away, visually it'll make a lot of sense. Okay, let's get a bit higher. Love this. It's pretty easy once you get the hang of it. We have a greater descent here, so it's more vertical, and then things get a bit more rocky. There's a bit of a wave to it, so we're more playful with our application here, and as I start to run out of pigment, I'll work into the negative space and just deliver a little bit of texture, but it's barely visible or noticeable. So I like that a lot. Before we add the snow, we're going to let that dry, and when we do, we're going to head over to the other side. Okay, so again, while that dries, we are going to head over here, and there's a big rock structure, which I can still kind of see because I made the markings with my brush strokes to make it distinctive. But I'll essentially draw in the edge here. And I'm not doing that to outline. We don't outline in painting, but we can show the light that is bouncing off the rock on the edge, and then we can move it inwards. And that's what I'm aiming to do here. All right. Now again, brush is fairly watery. We're going to have this larger patch of rock that stretches into the distance. Then we'll have an area that's raised, and then we again have a bit more of a flat surface. And we can indicate flat surfaces with more horizontal markings and climbing areas with more vertical line work. So when we have the two back and forth, it's pretty easy to figure out which areas are doing what. And I'm going to be a little bit more loose as I come down. We'll have areas that change in pattern. But as you can see, just very subtle texture to begin with. This area is fairly flat. Don't feel like you need to do an endless amount of this, because we are going to add snow, and that is going to be predominantly our texture and our highlight. But this does help us form shapes and almost practice where the snow is going to be, as this also acts as a slight highlight and informs us of what our movements will translate into when we are using a brighter, more noticeable value. There we go. See how it falls, and then it comes down here, and then it falls. Maybe you can't really see, maybe it's subtle to the point where that's difficult, and if so, that's not a bad thing, right? Subtlety really is the goal here. I'm going to have quite the fall. Light is going to wrap around these, so again, the edges are an important area to focus on. Trying not to make my edges or my markings too round either, because we do want this to look like somewhat of a sharp rock. I think we'll actually head back up here. And this is pretty intuitive, as it's reaching into the sky. We can tell from the snow that there are portions that get a bit more diagonal, but for the most part we are climbing. And let's get you a bit lower. Alright, so we're a little bit lower here on the canvas, and now we have an opportunity yet again to continue crafting some highlights. I think we're going to combine this part of the rock and this part of the rock right here. So you can see it comes down, and we'll build our textures for the rock. But once we get to this bottom area, we're going to start moving horizontally, downwards, and we're going to leave openings in between these. And those openings are going to imply the fact that the rock essentially just continues this way. But we have this separation, so it protrudes and then it goes in where the snow holds in crevices, and then it comes up with this protruding piece, and then we move back there again. Just small details, might get lost in the snow later, but it's good to have them just in case. And I'm doing a lot of line work through there, and I want to start moving it more into a textural tap. So we're going to do that. I feel like the lines help give me movement and intent in a way that we need, but it's the taps that create a lot of the rock-like aesthetic texture. So we're really aiming for a combination of the two. And with this, we'll also start combining some of the larger surface areas, jumping around pretty dramatically. And then we'll walk that down to the bottom. Very good. If anything, we can also do some very linear taps and markings through here. This is a different sheet of rock, right? This is more so on its own plane. Did the lines to define the movement, doing the taps to define the texture. And this is something where, again, we're going to want to take those steps back from the canvas. Make sure that we have everything where we actually want it to. We're not doing too much or too little. And it's that distant perspective that'll give us the real answers. Alright, so now that we have all of this in place, nice and dry, we're heading back to our liner brush. We're heading back to the pigment that we used for that snow. And we're going to continue working it in our mountain. However, we're going to be doing so very conscientiously. I'm looking for areas that we have just rendered that protrude, that catch light, so the brighter portions. And then we are working snow on top of them. Now my brush is pretty damp so that I get the sharp markings. My applications will occasionally be doubled up, thickened. I'm not going to be covering all of the highlights that we've just created, but enough of them. And we can also place this in areas where there aren't highlights. We can establish new ones essentially via the snow. But those markings we just created are a great entry point for it, for the most part. Now I'm doing quite a bit of this from a distance, just to show you, as per usual, how subtle things should be from NFR. However, this is pretty detail oriented. I'm applying it in multiple ways, so let's get you closer so you can see the detail work. So here we are, jumping right back into it. We have snow up here. We can connect it to our previous area, and I'm trying to do a lot of that connective tissue. So with these big pieces, you will notice that in a lot of scenarios we'll try to build off of it, find protrusions we can expand upon, little offshoots. Let's head back here. Lots of taps. Occasional drags. Trying to find the tops of surfaces. Sometimes we'll also work down vertically though. That's important to establish the fact that the snow and ice can kind of grapple the edges. Now we'll sorry, getting notifications on my phone. We are just going to work this down a little bit. Notice on the reference photo, there's a lot of very thin snow, as you can see. It essentially creates this pattern of diamond and triangular openings, and it leads into the larger bodies of rock. But I like this. Whenever we can introduce a new pattern, we have an opportunity to make the painting a lot more interesting, right? Now I'm going to take an area from that, just so we don't accidentally overdo it. And I'm going to expand the snow that we have through here. Remember, we want it to be creating offshoots from the bigger portions. And I'm continuing these lines. It's a very heavily slanted area, but I'm also breaking up the line. So we're continuing in the same movements in the same direction, but we're doing so with more unique pattern. Here you can see we reestablish it. This is such a quick and easy way to make the painting look so much more complete and real. I don't want this to look too messy, so I'm going to be a bit more sparse in this area, at least initially. Sticking to general pattern and idea. We can do the occasional little piece that does just stick out a bit more of an interesting fashion. This just lends believability to the painting, because if it's too structured, if there's too much pattern, it does look a little manufactured, and that isn't our goal. So pattern's important, breaking pattern's important. Discerning where and when to do that is just A, intuitive, B, something we learn as we paint more. Trying to find balances between negative space and detailed space, right? Not only would I say it's getting there, I would say it's quickly getting there. So let's continue through here. Very important area. Some thick taps and applications. Trying to grab more than just watery pigment for this. When it breaks off, you really want to establish the edges to be a bit more opaque, and then the farther away you get, the more transparent it can be. Now, for the same purpose of not accidentally overdoing that area, we're going to take a break from the bottom. We're going to head up, looking at these highlighted markings I already have pre-established, and we're just going in with a subtle application. Some of these are more thick than others, and intentionally so. You don't want all of your lines to be the same width and weight. Some of the snow that accumulates is going to simply be more, right? Now it's important to visually articulate that through these applications. Lots of taps. Continue some of this off here so we have a leading line into the canvas. Double down on areas we like. I'm not going to be afraid of getting too close to this edge, even though this is a new piece and it protrudes over top. Having them go in front of and behind each other is important, even if it makes it look a little bit visually messy. The realism is typically worth it. And here you can see I'm getting extremely playful. A lot of movement on the brush. Now, stepping back I think it's really coming along nicely. There are definitely still areas we can build on and expand. However, this isn't the only area of the painting where we're going to have these applications in the snow. And that means that we're not only balancing with these spots, but we're also balancing with the areas we're yet to do. So it's going to be responsible for us to stop applying all of this paint. It's very difficult. I just keep seeing little areas that I want to add and build on. But again, it would be responsible for us to take a little bit of a break from this spot and find ourselves over on the left-hand side, where we'll take that same pigment and we'll continue those same practices down this area of the mountain. And now we're creating these leading lines inwards, these leading textures and rhythms of pigment. It all adds up, right? Builds towards a larger composition. Now with this, you are going to want to frequently step back and look at this area in relation to that, because you don't want them to be competing, you want them to be harmonious. That said, we are still applying a lot of detail, and I do want you to be fairly close so you can see me apply it. So I'm going to get you closer. Just make sure that you are taking those steps back. Okay, back at it. And enthusiastically show. Enthusiastically so. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you know my trials with Invisalign and how I was actually incredibly happy with how that all turned out, but I still am getting used to talking with and without the Invisalign. So slur my words here and there unintentionally. Hopefully it just adds that comedic value to these lessons. But yeah. Much like the painting, talking has become a work in progress. But again, very happy with the process as a whole and definitely recommend it. Would do it again. Lots of little taps, especially as the pigment starts to run out and we can get a subtle tap. I don't like to do the taps too early on because then they're too opaque and bright and they stand out more than I'd like. But we can almost turn this into pointillism around the mid values, right behind the highlights with the taps, and then sparsely incorporate them into the darker shadows as well. Let's grab more pigment. Just in case our blues are different, I'm going to recover this. I'm going to create a different, unique shape. Deviate a bit from the reference photo, just because I think it'll work better in my version of the painting. Feel free to deviate for yours, however you feel it'll balance the composition best. And again, to take those steps back from the canvas. Make sure that you're giving it frequent, honest assessment in terms of the larger balancing. There we go. You might be hesitant to put snow on the very edge because it'll essentially just blend into the background, but it is an important piece of this. Your hues and your values will likely be a little bit different, and that will have a positive impact on the painting. Very subtle one, but a positive one nonetheless. So now we step back, and I think it's quite balanced. That said, I do want to re-interject some of the rock in between the larger patches of snow. So we'll grab our Mars Black, not too much of it, Titanium White, Cerulean Blue, mix up that same dark rock color that we were playing with earlier. And remember, it's not a pure Mars Black, but it is the darkest value we have on the canvas. Switch to our liner, and then just going to create various openings to render a more natural transition into these larger blocks of blue. Just the occasional little opening will do a lot for the painting. Maybe we could use a bit more Mars Black, and I don't normally mix pigment with the liner brush because it's just much more convenient when you have a brush that has a larger body, but we don't need too much pigment through here, so it'll work out well enough. If we apply these dots more so into the center portion, it'll make it look like it's not very dense, like there isn't a lot of snow sitting there. So if you want the snow to look dense, like there's an abundance, avoid that for the most part. You could have like one or two, it could just be a rock on top, or one that's very sharp, protruding. But for the most part, if you want the snow to look abundant, we apply these towards the edges, because it makes the edges of the snow look like there isn't as much, and then the volume builds towards the center. Okay, so now let's go back to the background, really our primary focus, and let's build up some highlights. Now for this, we are going to need the brightest snow color we've mixed yet. So I'm going to mix this over top the snow color that we used here, and we're going to add extra titanium white. We're going to use less Mars Black, but still a little bit. Mix up an abundant amount. Let's go brighter, because whatever we apply will be darker on the canvas. And we'll switch back, you guessed it, to the liner brush. Now we're going to apply this to the areas that receive the most light that we want to stand out. Tops of these are a great area, and you can see that it is brighter, but very minorly. And to be honest, I want something a bit more impactful. So, we'll put our brush down, go back to the mix. More titanium white. Just off to the side there. Mixing it with what we had. Back to the liner. This is going to have a lot of light as it's more flat. This row too. You can already see the built-up volume already having an impact. I might leave the edges a bit darker so it looks like the snow on the top is compounding, catching more light as it protrudes higher. And the shadows are cast towards the edges. I don't want to do too much of the highlight towards the bottom though, because the closer we get to the bottom, the less light the area receives. So this is predominantly for the top, and then it dissipates as we work our way down. But it's already having such an impact. Very happy to see that. Very, very happy to see that. I'm not going to do too much on this one over here because I don't want to draw the eye over here too dramatically. We still need some to keep it cohesive, but we'll be responsible. And we're not just applying it in large batches. We're also going in with those same taps and other applications that we did previously in the painting. In my attempt to do less over here, I kind of left it feeling unfinished. So I'm going to do a little bit more, carefully so, but we'll draw this together. Good. And I'm building it up multiple times. Select areas, because every time we build it up, the brighter it'll get. Need a lot up here. There are no shadows within this vicinity. It's just bright light and snow. It'll almost get lost in the clouds a little bit. That's okay. If it happens, it happens. If the values make sense, they make sense. Still have this dissipate as we move down. Really building these areas up. Now yet again, we get a bit closer. Grab that pigment. You can see how similar it is to that of the cloud when they're right next to each other. You can see us losing that highlight as you work down. Just letting the paint actually run out on my brush. Very easy way of creating that natural transition. Grab a bit more water, a bit more pigment, move to the left-hand side. Add a bit more. Let it dissipate downwards. There we go. Looks like we have some beautiful light hitting the edges, which is always the goal. And some tapped texture. Okay, so now yet again, for maybe the final time, we're taking that step back. I'm going to create a slightly brighter variant of what we had for the snow there, and we'll build up those highlights. Though I will say, I do really think the added highlights to this dramatically helped. It's brightest at the top, and then the snow slowly gets darker and darker in highlights, and didn't add any down there. I think that progression is quite valuable. So, with that, again, we are mixing quite a bit of cerulean blue because we're in a more cool area, more shadow intensive. We'll just do a little test. Could be slightly darker, not by much, but slightly. Going for another test. Now it needs to be more blue. While the Mars Black darkened it, it did desaturate it. So we need to give that pigment back, and that's perfect. So, put that down, pick up, you guessed it, the liner brush. And now we can go in and we can not apply this to all of our snow, but little bits here and there. Areas that'll be higher up, catch light. We can let it dissipate and create mounds. More of the light is going to be going this way, so I'm starting predominantly on the left-hand side of our snow here. Just like so. I think it's making a big difference. That said, we are coming to the end of our lesson, and if you've watched the channel before, you know that I do like to give little keywords, ones that you can use in the comment section. You can incorporate it into a comment, or you can just use the word as the comment itself, but essentially notes that you are on average part of the only 13% who makes it to the end of the videos. So you're part of the dedicated community. I think it speaks really well to the fact that you'll probably do a great job with the painting. You were dedicated, you're tuned in, you were listening to all of the techniques and advice, and I think that goes a long way. So it's kind of like a little badge of honor, and it's fun to see who continuously gets them week after week. Today, I think our keyword is vast. So you can work that into a comment. You can just use it as the comment, but it will tell me and everybody else who got this far in the video that you are part of the dedicated community. Okay, I like that. It's textured, it's layered, it's volume, it's subtle. Let's go back and do a little bit more over here. Just build up those highlights. I'd also again like to say a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for making this lesson and all of the other lessons on this channel happen. Friendly reminder, you can get the traceables, reference photos, images of the tools, all of my ebooks, larger 24 by 36 inch bonus lessons that aren't up on YouTube, your name at the end of the credits, a bunch of fun things up there that will help and aid you in the painting process. So check it out if you're interested. And you can also find my brush line in the video description. So if you want to work with the exact same brushes that I've been doing this with, you can do so too. I love going back and adding these details. I just think it adds so much to the painting, and it's something that I know I could just do for hours. Really get lost in the process. I think that's the best. It tells you you're spending your time doing the right things, doing what you really love. Right? And you just get lost in it. I noted, well, I hope you do get lost in this and spend that time, get invested, love it. Do make sure that you're getting up to get a glass of water here and there, you have some food. It's important to stay healthy. I know that as artists, it's pretty easy to spend, 8 hours at a canvas and just enjoy every minute of them. But make sure you're healthy too. It's about balance, and stepping away from the canvas can also be great because it gives you that perspective when you come back. You get those fresh eyes, right? That said, I think we're just about there. I think this is our painting. Very proud of what it turned into. From all of those loose blocked-in layers to something textured and detailed, atmospheric, and vast. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being a part of the community. Thank you for watching along. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. We are going to be doing a lot more lessons just like this, nice and detailed, right? Also, a little spoiler for the future, I will be giving this painting away on Patreon. There's going to be a new tier for it. I'm going to launch that in December, which when this is going up, it may be December. So keep your eyes out for that, and we'll talk soon. You be well, you be safe, you take care, and again, you stay creative.